We are joined today by the amazing Professor Zethu Matebeni, who is joining us here today all the way from South Africa. Zethu Matebeni is a sociologist, activist, and writer whose research focuses on African queer theory, sexualities, and gender. She has edited and co-edited various volumes on African LGBTQI+ life, including Reclaiming African, Queer in Africa, which was actually very instrumental for my dissertation, so thank you. Also Beyond the Mountains. Her works appear in numerous academic journals, books, and blogs. She's a visiting professor at the Center for Women and Gender Studies at Nelson Mandela University. And Zethu holds the South African Research Chair in Sexualities, Gender, and Queer Studies, University of Fort Worth. Thank you so much for being here, Zethu. How are you today?
Thank you, Adebayo. Thank you. I am well, thank you. Hello, everybody. It's so great to see so many people. Thank you for putting on your cameras. I know that people from all over the world, Canada, South Africa, everywhere, Germany, and in the UK. So it's really great. I'm very well, and I want to thank all of you for coming today, for joining this session. And I want to say a special thank you actually to the team at Queer Disrupt for all the work that you've done, to Hannah, to Nick, and especially to you, Adebayo. But in particular, I also want to say a shout out and thank you to Professor Azrini Wakendin, who's also on this call today, because Azrini was the one who actually made the connection between Queer Disrupt and myself. And yeah, so thank you so much.
Absolutely. Thank you so much, Azrini. Azrini has been so instrumental in this event happening, and this could not have happened at all without Azrini's support. So absolutely, thank you so much, Azrini, for making this happen. We also please make use of the chat respectfully. But as things are going on, let us know your thoughts, let us know your opinions. You can start like conversing with each other in the chat. All right, so Zethu, let's get started. And I thought we could actually start the conversation by addressing the elephant in the room of queerness, or well, I guess art as a form of activism for queer people. And I really wanted us to start by exploring what the benefits of arts as activism for queer people are, especially in the context of how art can be a good form of expression and articulation for our existences, especially as students in university spaces. And I thought this was possibly something you could like help us shed some light into.
Sure. Okay. So great, Adebayo. Basically, I think to start off, I'll say I come to this topic of view of art from two angles. Firstly, through seeing queer Africans using art to ensure that they are visible, to assert and reimagine themselves as being in existence, because especially within the African context, we have been erased from histories. And secondly, through my personal encounters at South African universities during protests, with students, where I witnessed students using art or performance to signify resistance and resilience. And I'll talk a little bit about those later. So the benefits of queer aesthetics and art, or art as activism for queer people, is in the remaking of the past and the future, and perhaps offering a different view of the present, if you want to say that. Queer people in Africa in particular are constantly fighting against invisibilization, denied existence, criminalization, torture, or a death sentence. So the space offered by queer aesthetics opens up possibilities for different kinds of potentialities. And these are crucial if we want to imagine ourselves into existence. My experience of art as activism, most recently in the academic space, has been through protests, particularly during the Rhodes Must Fall movement in 2015 in South Africa. And so some of you may know the Rhodes Must Fall movement because it also came to UK, or there were these movements within the UK and other parts of the world. So during this time, I participated, witnessed, and analyzed resilience and resistance, which are both key features in Black women and queer people survival in the academy. And a lot of scholars have written about Black people's experiences within academic spaces. What I found interesting was Black students' ability to refuse resilience, that they will not remain intact and bounce back, because we know resilience is about this ability to bounce back. in the face of persistent injustice and oppression. In addition, art as protest disrupted the continued presence of apartheid in South Africa. And of course, we do know that the roots of apartheid in South Africa is colonization. And I mean, we can talk a little bit about the actual forms of art that took place on campuses, but I was interested in looking at the ones that I engaged or I was part of within the university. So during Rhodes Must Fall, so I talk a little bit about the Trans Collective and other art forms by students and faculty members within the university space. Yeah, so I think that's where I'll start to contextualize this conversation in that way.
Amazing, amazing. And thank you so much for mentioning Trans Collective, because that's something that you mentioned very, very beautifully in your text that you sent to me to read before this. And I found a YouTube video that I think would help the audience as well really understand the context of what the Trans Collective did and kind of their presence in the decolonizing movement in Rhodes Must Fall in South Africa. I'm going to share my screen very quickly just so we can watch.
Okay, so maybe let me just say what the Trans Collective is. So the Trans Collective was formed. That would be great. Yes, the Trans Collective was formed during the Rhodes Must Fall movement, out of the frustration with an overwhelmingly heteronormative decolonization movement, which was Rhodes Must Fall. Students who were part of the Trans Collective, they identified as gender non-conforming, non-binary, and trans-diverse. So since March 9, 2015, they've been part of the Rhodes Must Fall movement, but have been consistently challenging the patriarchy and misogyny within the movement. So while all the students who were part of Rhodes Must Fall were all against coloniality in the academy, for the Trans Collective, the decolonization imperative lacked what they called a trans-feminist intersectional analysis, which they inevitably introduced. So in the first instance, they brought their visibility to the fore by adopting the slogan, giving content to decoloniality. So that was what the Trans Collective was about, giving content to decoloniality. So as you will see in the video, they were using their voices and bodies, and they offered what I call a militant form of trans-feminist politics that was not shy to occupy space, to undo erasure and invisibility at any cost. In addition, the Trans Collective positioned itself as challenging rigid and toxic gender constructs and hypermasculinity, which were becoming prominent within the decolonization project of the Rhodes Must Fall movement. So the video that you're going to see is actually one of the interventions that the Trans Collective did, which was dubbed the Trans Capture. So it was a naked protest that disrupted tokenism of trans bodies in the celebration of the first year of the Rhodes Must Fall movement. And 7 students painted their naked bodies in red paint, and then they lay on the floor of the Center for African Studies Art Gallery. So yeah, so that's the context to the video.
And just before we watch the video, first of all, I do want to warn that it's quite graphic. So there are some graphic, particularly with nudity. And I think just to put emphasis on something that Zetty said, which is they were not shy. And that's something that I think is very important when presenting queer aesthetics, is that you cannot be shy. And you'll see that evidence kind of in the clip. I'll play it now. Amazing, amazing. That was powerful. That was powerful. And like, I'm trying to imagine what I would be, what I would do in that kind of position, having experienced something like that. And I feel like what I think I see here that I think is so amazing is you see this display of how, I guess, queer bodies can kind of come into play when presenting aesthetics of resistance, because kind of with the use of their bodies as a form of activism, there is this simultaneous decolonizing effort that's happening, but also like kind of this way of challenging that lack of inclusion of queer people in the first place, especially when you think about like how heteronormative the decolonizing movement with Rhodes Must Fall might be. And I feel like if we can establish that, you know, queerness is this thing that is inherent to a lot of African existences and how colonialism has kind of changed that and warped that, I think in my head, I see decolonization and queer issues as simultaneous, but also one and the same. And like, is that something that you agree with, or I guess could provide some nuance into? Because I genuinely feel like these two issues, while we separate them, are actually the same thing, especially in the African context.
Yeah, I think it's I think that's a powerful reading, and I remember one of the things that the Trans Collective always talked about was, well, what the Trans Collective now was the queer revolution at the same university, and sometimes they would come together. And one of the statements they used to make was there could never be decolonization without queerness, and that almost the arriving at queerness would make possibilities for decolonization to exist. And I think that's an important thing to consider, because we do know that particularly higher education in South Africa, and maybe possibly in many other parts of the world, is heteronormative, and it's also homophobic and transphobic. And so what then would it mean to decolonize a space when you are still stuck within the kinds of regimes that exclude a whole range of people? And I must admit that having experienced the university space with the Trans Collective in existence and the queer revolution, things felt a little bit lighter. And I wouldn't say necessarily that the university was decolonized, definitely not, but there were some definite attempts to ensure that the issues around the gender binary and the rigidity kind of like are starting to loosen up a little bit. So even things that the university never considered, for example, student cards, how students would apply to university. Why does it matter that you would have to give, why does it matter that the sex assigned to you automatically qualifies you to a particular room at the university residence? So all these kinds of things, or that if your card is only given to a particular to one sex, then you can't access certain parts of the university. So all these things had to be undone. And of course, this goes a long way into unsettling the ways we've understood what gender is. And of course, African feminists and gender theorists and queer theorists have written a lot about the ways we have, I suppose, we have forgotten about gender fluidity. And having students such as the Trans Collective and Queer Revolution on campus, it forced us to go back to that archive, and possibly start creating a different kind of university space.
Absolutely. Shout out to Oyeronke Oyewumi, Sylvia Tamale. These are African feminist theorists that are really doing this work to really remember kind of this idea of gender practices in our life. Invention of Women, best book I've ever read in my life. But also African Sexualities, which you contributed to as well,
yes.
which really does explore gender and sexuality.
Yes, I did. But I mean, also another point that's also, so if people remember Dr. Stella Nyanzi, who is now a prominent, politician, but a scholar, a queer scholar in her own right, did a naked protest at the University of Makerere University in Uganda. And that kind of protest also, it resonated a lot with the Trans Collective, but it also resonated a lot with a lot of work that Sylvia Tamale did, because she wrote this huge this text, which was part of her inaugural lecture for her professorship on nudity and what nakedness does, particularly for African bodies. And so, there are many ways in which we can understand the protest that not just the students did on campus, but how African people are engaging with the body in a different, they've always engaged with nudity, but now it's coming up in different ways. So the encounter with a trans body for many people is a scary thing. And so here we are at the University of Cape Town, and you have to engage with it. And how do you engage with that? And so I think these questions have become so exciting and very powerful, as many people have said on the chat, within this notion of decolonization.
And one thing that I also wanted to mention, oh, by the way, I've put in the chat the books I mentioned just now. So Invention of Women by Oyeron Koyewumi and African Sexualities by Sylvia Tamale. They're both amazing, amazing books. But one thing that I also wanted to mention was that another thing that the Trans Collective did during my research was they actually also stormed a robing of Sarah Baartman. So for people that don't know, Sarah Baartman was kind of this South African woman who was objectified during the colonial project for her body. And essentially there was this nude sculpture of Sarah Baartman in the museum, and Black women came in and kind of robed that figure. And for me, it was this, on one hand, you had kind of these women who came into this space to challenge the objectification of women, right? So they came into that space on one side to robe that sculpture and challenge and resist this objectification of Black women's bodies. So for them, being clothed is kind of the aesthetics of choice because of the specific history. And then you had on another side, these trans collective activists who, you know, are challenging the visibility by being naked in those spaces as well. So for them, being naked is their aesthetics of choice, again, because of that specific history. And I think it's how these two can be reconciled to actually understand that they can coexist, and absolutely should, in regards to the specificity of how decolonization needs to happen in different contexts, if that makes sense.
No, certainly it makes sense. I don't see these two as contrasts, actually. I think they work in the same frame.
Right.
So Naminata Diabate talks about disrobing as one's last weapon. And I think this is very important because we do understand that the act of disrobing or partaking in a nude protest is what we can think of as one's last resort. It's the last tool that you can use. It's like your body becomes the weapon, the last weapon that you can use. And so for students, I think, as I said, disrobing is a political tool. What it does, it highlights the agency of the actor. And again, it shows that, as I said, it is the last weapon. The sculpture, however, it signified something different for Black women, as you've mentioned, right? And this sculpture, it had been at the university for a long time, since 2000, actually. And African feminists, Black feminists have been, you know, having issues with the sculpture, telling the university that actually, you know, we can't in 2000 have a sculpture of Sarah Baartman naked. You know, something has to be done with the sculpture. And of course, the artist himself, Willie Bester, didn't like this idea that this sculpture is being debated, because at some point, what needed to happen was that there should be interventions on the sculpture. So this, as I said, you know, it signified the kind of humiliation that Sarah Baartman endured, even under the guise of science. And it got worse at the University of Cape Town because the sculpture was up at the top of the stairs of the library. So as you entered the library, inside the library, you would then encounter this sculpture. And of course, for many Black students, they'd be like, I can't. Like as soon as I walk into the library and I see this sculpture of what to me looks like an ionized Black woman naked, it takes away my ability to learn, my ability to read. So it became a kind of like violent force. And so it was important then for Black feminists to actually go and do a ritual on the sculpture. So it was not just the robing, there was an entire ritual on it. So the burning of impepo or incense and the chanting, there were, we wrote notes, kind of like notes to Sarah, to current day Sarah Baartman, to all the Sarah Baartmans of today, to say that this can never happen again in history. And all of these were stuck on the cloth that then robed the sculpture. So it was a very important kind of like healing and cathartic action, because what had happened, what we're doing was to bring back dignity to those whose agency had been stripped off, including Sarah Baartman, or the Sarah Baartmans that we were finding ourselves to be.
Amazing. Wow. That sounds so beautiful. And I think it's the way you've articulated just this, again, taking agency into essentially just telling our own narratives and presenting ourselves how we want to be seen. And I think that's very important, particularly as a people who aren't usually seen as a normative, in knowledge production. And I think that's, I would really like to use this point to segue into this idea of how we discuss the pedagogical tools that we use to inform our queer arts and our aesthetics. And I think something you've mentioned rightfully is the fact that nudity is quite a big thing in African epistemologies as a form of resistance. And when I say pedagogical tools, for people that don't understand, I just kind of mean our ways of educating ourselves, consciousness raising, exchanging knowledge. And one thing I can attest to, and I think Zetu, you might agree with me on this, is the fact that a lot of the tools that we do use can be quite Western. And again, I guess I'll be curious to get your thoughts as to the implications of this on our aesthetics as queer people, right? Especially when they're informed by this, again, hegemony that the West kind of has against on knowledge. And I guess I really wanted to understand in the context of what do we lose and what do we gain by the use of these Western theories, particularly Western queer theory, which I think has been proliferated globally now at this point.
Yeah, okay. Before I answer the question on Western queer theory, which I like a lot because I'll link it to something else, I do want to talk about the university space in South Africa. And it's important for me to talk about it now because if anybody is following what's happening in South Africa at the moment, is that we are once again having student protests, okay? So we continue to see these protests at the moment, and I characterize the university space in South Africa as a crime scene for Black people. This is how I see it. And this, for me, has many implications. And we have seen the ways sexual violence has been perpetuated on female students in West African universities. I mean, many of you have watched the BBC documentary. We've seen how Black students have been shot at and murdered at university campuses. If you remember the situation at Garissa University. Also, students being shot and murdered during student protests in South Africa. And so our university campuses in South Africa have become or have seen many bullets and chemical weapons. And I think this is worrying because it does say something about the nature of the South African academy. So it suggests to me, at least, that violence and the university space go hand in hand. So, and for queer people in Africa, they know violence very well. Okay, we and yeah, we have been murdered and murdered and murdered and murdered over and over again. So we have, as a society, I think there's a lot to learn from the meeting of queerness with violence, especially for the university space. And I think part of our work as people invested in knowledge production and people who occupy university spaces is to undo this strong link between violence and the university, so that the space does not remain a site of unnecessary deaths. And of course, these are difficult issues to unpack, as you say, Adebayo, because we need to engage with the meaning of the university in the first place, and particularly for the colonized subject in Africa. So with regards to Western knowledge or Western hegemony, especially in relation to queerness. So I will, I know we're almost running out of time, but I want to come back to something that you did allude to at one point about understanding what queerness is. So, for example, you suggested that looking at Butler's work in Critically Queer, Butler says queer will have to remain that which is in the present, never fully owned. Okay, and then there was a suggestion that perhaps there is a knowing or unknowing that needs to happen. So if we had to look at rethinking Western queer theory, okay, we'll have to investigate further what queer meant for Butler and what queer means for African queers. Okay, so there's a question around knowing, the ability to know, and the lack of definition around queerness or queer. So if we leave Butler for a moment and entertain this idea of knowing, I think one of the people who can help us think through this notion is Serena Dankwa's latest book, Knowing Women, Same-Sex Intimacy, Gender and Identity in Post-Colonial Ghana, where she responds to this question really well. So Dankwa refers to knowing how to value and pursue intimate same-sex desires. And the value she offers is on generating alternative languages or terms rather than fixing or politicizing a term. So we've all been so excited about queer, and we've kind of assumed that queer does all the work for us, and perhaps it doesn't. So pursuing knowledge, pursuing this idea of knowing, it requires patience, observing, and participating in various care strategies. So what she does then is she's less invested in the terms that we use, the lesbian, the gay, the bisexual, the trans, etc., but she's more interested in the generative effort of knowing. So that's one version, and we can unpack knowing, and as she does in her own way, but we can also unpack knowing in the African context. So queer also has its limitations. So many people use it as an all-encompassing term, but this can be disputed, particularly in the African context, although we are using it. So if queer can, so I would ask then, can queer accommodate that which exists in the norm, but operates in the realms of other forms of knowing, as in the sense that Dankwa illustrates? But we also know that queer does hide diversities between groups of people. So this idea of queer has been criticized by a number of, well, a few African scholars, including Stella Nyanzi, who warns that queer is a neo-imperial concept. And I think this is important to pay attention to, particularly because I'm located in South Africa. And so how queer has translated from the US into South Africa and then into the rest of the continent is problematic. But we also have to think about race in relation to queer. So E. Patrick Johnson, for example, proposes an alternative to queer theory because of its lack and limitations in the reading of Black communities. So Johnson criticizes queer for posing a false unifying umbrella, which all queers of all races, ethnicities, and classes share, are shared under. And of course, we have to pay attention to this. But the other, and of course, if you look at Johnson, Johnson then offers an alternative to queer and says queer studies. Yeah, queer studies, looking at southern, what happens in southern US, in southern US states.
Yeah.
But we also need to make sense of the shift from queer to queer, queer with a K, K-W-E-E-R, as an Afrocentric decolonizing strategy, as proposed by H. Sharif Herokuti Williams. So Williams suggests that we would have to step out of the confines of Western epistemological traditions. Okay?
See the detail really on this. Yeah, the screen is way too small.
So we have to step out, we have to step out of the confines of Western epistemological traditions, and we would then need to recreate realities that are currently not in common use. And some of these realities that Herokuti talks about are not within Western epistemologies. And so these are new realities we have to recreate. So they talk about rhythm and music. We know this within African context, that storytelling is through music and rhythm, you know, song and dance, etc. So there are a lot of different ways in which we can recreate the ways in which we can know. Okay, but I know, Adebayo, you are, I know this is also part of your field, right? Your work features a great deal, it features queer a great deal, while simultaneously working against these Western epistemological traditions. So I'm curious, how has this journey unraveled for your work so far?
Well, to be perfectly honest, Setu, I thought it had unraveled, but I just realized that it hadn't, because you've really just blown my mind even more and further unraveled it. Because now I'm like, I need to go and look at that because I haven't already. And I think this is something that's so amazing in regards to this discussion right now, because it's really giving me understandings that while I'm talking about myself, dissociating myself from Western paradigms, I'm still at the beginning of my research process, so I'm still getting the hang of this, but it really does show you how the more you know, the more you realize what you don't know. and the more you actually need to go and understand. So this idea of queer is something I've come across before. This is the idea of queer, right? This QUARE understanding of queerness, which kind of understands the whole idea of race and how that comes into things. So my primary position of how I define queerness has kind of been this, while so I've always attempted to situate queerness outside of sex and sexuality, because I do believe like this is a very limited understanding of it. And it's always kind of been this idea of a non-identitarian, non-normative, a rejection of like normative structures, right? So it's this idea that, you know, situating queer in the unknown and understanding this idea that queerness is everything's normal, but not because nothing's normal, and kind of a rejection of any form of normativity. And that's kind of always been my approach to queerness. But I think also, and I think this is where this discussion is so useful, because while I understand queerness in that form, I'm still a university student who has to write papers, who has to do this on queerness, and still has to adhere to some form of these normative structures. And it really, and I think conversations like these really do make you understand how limiting these are in regards to you really understanding that. And I think this is something you mentioned earlier and alluded to about it being a crime scene, right? And it being violent, because essentially you're understanding that, like, while I'm not necessarily being attacked like physically, the idea that there is a limitation to my learning in itself is a violent act that is happening right now, because of how limited the university space has and can be. Because again, like my research, because I did a podcast with Queer Disrupt on Rotimi Fani Kayode, where I kind of re-queered an already queer work. This was
fantastic, by the way.
Thank you. Which was like kind of supposed to be this extension, but even understanding this new concept of queer, right? So KWEER, which I'm going to be completely honest and vulnerable here. This is the first time I'm ever coming across this. And I will absolutely go and do my homework on it. But it's like, I'm now understanding that there are so many ways that we could stretch this even further, right? And this is why I really wanted us to understand this idea of this pedagogical tools and how we teach ourselves about queerness. And you mentioned dancing, you mentioned music, and other ways of, like, I guess, presenting the knowledge that we've learned and different ways of actually knowing and understanding. And this is so fascinating to me. Like, you have no idea, Zetu. This has been so enlightening.
No, that's great. You know, it's in South Africa, so a lot of Black communities, they can't say the word queer, because it's not, it just doesn't come right. But we have a word which is derogatory, and it refers to, it's used against foreign nationals, and it's quere. And so it's been so interesting to see how a lot of people would rather say, I am queer, but they're not foreign. So, and then at the same time, so South Africa is also considered this very xenophobic country, right? But there are people who can say, yeah, but I am queer. They are queer as in they are foreign, but they're also not foreign in that way. So the kind of distancing, but also the closeness that queer or queer does amongst Africans, you know, because of language, is also very interesting. So I think there's a lot we can learn around language, and also especially when we play outside the frame of, you know, of Western terminologies and Western ways of understanding.
Amazing. Oh wow, thank you so much, Zetu. You've given us so much to think about.